was in my room one night when I heard something in the corridor. I looked up from my work and saw an envelope slide under the door. It was a thick envelope, but not so thick that it couldn't be pushed under the door. My name was written on the envelope, and what was inside purported to be a letter from my wife. I say purported, because even though the grievances could only have come from someone who'd spent 23 years observing me on an intimate day-to-day basis, the charges were outrageous and completely out of keeping with my wife's character. Most important, however, the handwriting was not my wife's handwriting. But if it wasn't her handwriting, then whose words was it? I wish now that I'd kept the letter, so that I could reproduce it down to the last comma, the last uncharitable exclamation point. The tone's what I'm talking about now, not just the content. But I didn't keep it, I'm sorry to say. I lost it, or else I misplaced it. Later, after the sorry business I'm about to relate, I was cleaning out my desk, and I may have accidentally thrown it away, which is uncharacteristic of me, since I usually don't throw anything away. In any case, I have a good memory. I can recall every word of what I read. My memory is such that I used to win prizes in school because of my ability to remember names and dates, inventions, battles, treaties, alliances, and the like. I always scored highest on factual tests, and in later years, in the real world as it's called, my memory stood me in good stead. For instance, if I were asked right now to give the details of the Council of Trent, or the Treaty of Utrecht, or to talk about Carthage, that city razed by the Romans after Hannibal's defeat, the Roman soldiers ploughed salt into the ground so that Carthage could never be called Carthage again, I could do so. If called upon to talk about the 7 Years' War, the 30 Years or the 100 Years' War, or simply the First Celestian War, I could hold forth with the greatest enthusiasm and confidence. Ask me anything about the Tartars, Renaissance popes, or the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, Thermopylae, Shiloh, or the Maxim gun. Easy. Tannenberg. Simple as Blackbird pie. The famous 4-20 that was set before the king at Agincourt. English longbows carried the day. And here's something else. Everyone's heard of the Battle of Lepanto, the last great sea battle fought in ships powered by galley slaves. This fracas took place in 1571 in the eastern Mediterranean, when the combined naval forces of the Christian nations of Europe turned back the Arab hordes under the infamous Ali Mazin Zadi, a man who was fond of personally cutting off the noses of his prisoners before calling in the executioners. But does anyone remember that Cervantes was involved in this affair, and had his left hand locked off in this battle? And something else. The combined French and Russian losses in one day at Borodino were 75,000 men, the equivalent in fatalities of a fully loaded jumbo jet crashing every 3 minutes from breakfast to sundown. Kazutov pulled his forces back towards Moscow. Napoleon drew breath, marshaled his troops, and continued his advance. He entered the downtown area of Moscow, where he stayed for a month waiting for Kazutov, who never showed his face again. The Russian Generalissimo was waiting for the snow and ice, for Napoleon to begin his retreat to France. These things stick in my head. I remember. So when I say I can recreate the letter, the portion that I read, which catalogues the charges against me, I mean what I say. In part, the letter went as follows. Dear, things are not good. Things, in fact, are bad. Things have gone from bad to worse. I think you know what I'm talking about. We've come to the end of the line. It's over with us. Still, I find myself wishing we could have talked about it. It's been such a long time now since we talked. I mean really talked. Even after we were married, we used to talk and talk, exchange news and ideas. When the children were little, or even after they were more grown up, we still found time to talk. It was more difficult then, naturally, but we managed. We found time. We made time. We'd have to wait until they were asleep, or when they were playing outside, or with a sitter, but we managed. Sometimes we'd engage a sitter just so we could talk. On occasion we talked the night away, talked until the sun came up. Well, things happen, I know. Things change. Bill had that trouble with the police, and Linda found herself pregnant. Our quiet time together flew out the window. and gradually your responsibilities backed up on you. Your work became more important, and our time together was squeezed out. Then, once the children left home, our time for talking was back. We had each other again. Only we had less and less to talk about. It happens. I hear some wise men saying, and he's right. It happens. But it happened to us. In any case, no blame. No blame. That's not what this letter's about. I want to talk about us. I want to talk about now. The time's come, you see, to admit that the impossible has happened. To cry uncle. To beg off. I read this far and stopped. Something was wrong. Something was fishy in Denmark. The sentiments expressed in the letter may have belonged to my wife. Maybe they did. Say they did. Grant that the sentiments expressed were hers. But the handwriting was not her handwriting, and I ought to know. I consider myself an expert in the matter of her handwriting. And yet if it wasn't her handwriting, who on earth had written these letters? I should say a little something about ourselves and our life here. During the time I'm writing about, we were living in a house we'd taken for the summer. I'd just recovered from an illness that had set me back in most things I'd hoped to accomplish that spring. We were surrounded on 3 sides by meadows, birchwoods, and some low rolling hills. A territorial view, as the realtor had called it when he described it to us over the phone. In front of the house was a lawn that had grown shaggy, owing to a lack of interest on my part, and a long gravelled drive that led to the road. Behind the road we could see the distant peaks of the mountains, thus the phrase territorial view, having to do with a vista appreciated only at a distance. My wife had no friends here in the country, and no one came to visit. Frankly, I was glad for the solitude. But she was a woman who was used to having friends, used to dealing with shopkeepers and tradesmen. Out here it was just the 2 of us, thrown back on our resources. Once upon a time a house in the country would have been our ideal. It would have been coveted. Now I can see it wasn't such a good idea. No, it wasn't. Both our children had left home long ago. Now and then a letter would come from one of them. And once in a blue moon, on a holiday, say, one of them might telephone. A collect call, naturally. My wife being only too happy to accept the charges. This seeming indifference on their part was, I believe, a major cause of my wife's sadness and general discontent. A discontent, I have to admit, I've been vaguely aware of before our move to the country. In any case, to find herself in the country after so many years living so close to a shopping mall and a bus service, with a taxi no farther away than the telephone in the hall, it must have been hard on her. Very hard. I think her decline, as a historian might put it, was accelerated by our move to the country. I think she slipped a cog after that. I'm speaking from hindsight, of course, which always tend to confirm the obvious. I don't know what else to say in regard to this matter of the handwriting. How much more can I say and still retain credibility? We were alone in the house. No one else, to my knowledge anyway, was in the house and could have penned the letter. Yet I remain convinced to this day that it was not her handwriting that covered the pages of the letter. After all, I had been reading my wife's handwriting since before she was my wife, as far back as what might be called our prehistory days. The time she went away to school as a girl, wearing a grey and white school uniform. She wrote letters to me every day that she was away, and she was away for 2 years, not counting holidays and summer vacations. Altogether, in the course of our relationship, I would estimate, a conservative estimate too, counting our separations and short periods of time that I was away on business or in hospital, I would estimate, as I say, that I received 1,700, or possibly 1,850 handwritten letters from her, not to mention hundreds, maybe thousands, more informal notes. On your way home, please pick up dry cleaning, and some spinach pasta from Corty Bros. I'd recognise her handwriting anywhere in the world. Give me a few words, I'd be confident if I were in Jaffa or Marrakesh, and picked up a note in the marketplace. I would recognise it as my wife's handwriting. A word even. Take this word, talked, for instance. That simply isn't the way that she talked. Yet I'm the first to admit that I don't know whose handwriting it was if it wasn't hers. Secondly, my wife never underlined her words for emphasis. Never. I don't recall a single instance of her doing this. Not once in our entire married life. Not to mention the letters I received from her before we were married. It would be reasonable enough, I suppose, to point out that this could happen to anyone. That is, anyone could find himself in a situation that is completely atypical and, given the pressure of the moment, do something totally out of character, draw a line, the merest line under a word, or maybe under an entire sentence. I'd go so far as to say that every word of this entire letter, so-called, though I haven't read it through in its entirety, and won't, since I can't find it now, is utterly false. I don't mean false in the sense of untrue, necessarily. There is some truth, perhaps, to the charges. I don't want to quibble. I don't want to appear small in this matter. Things are bad enough already in this department. No. What I want to say, all I want to say, is that while the sentiments expressed in the letter may be my wife's, may even hold some truth and be legitimate, so to speak, the force of the accusations levelled against me is diminished, if not entirely undermined, even discredited, because she did not in fact write the letter, or if she did write it, then discredited by the fact that she didn't write it in her own handwriting. Such evasion is what makes men hunger for facts. As always, there are some. On the evening in question we ate dinner rather silently, but not unpleasantly, as was our custom. From time to time I looked up and smiled across the table as my way of showing gratitude for the delicious meal. Poached salmon, fresh asparagus, rice pilaf with almonds. The radio played softly in the other room. It was a little suite by Poulenc. I'd first heard on digital recording 5 years before in an apartment on Van Ness in San Francisco during a thunderstorm. Then we'd finished eating, and after we'd had our coffee and dessert, my wife said something that startled me. "Are you planning on being in your room this evening?" she said. "I am," I said. "What did you have in mind?" "Simply wanted to know." She picked up a cup and drank some coffee, but she avoided looking at me, even though I tried to catch her eye. "Are you planning to be in your room this evening?" Such a question was altogether out of character for her. I wonder now why on earth I didn't pursue this at the time. She knows my habits, if anyone does, but I think her mind was made up even then. I think she was concealing something even as she spoke. "Of course I'm planning on being in my room this evening," I repeated, perhaps a trifle impatiently. She didn't say anything else, and neither did I. I drank the last of my coffee and cleared my throat. She glanced up and held my eyes a moment. Then she nodded, as if we'd agreed on something. But we hadn't, of course. She got up and began to clear the table. I felt as if dinner had somehow ended in an unsatisfactory note. Something else, a few words maybe, was needed to round things off and put the situation right again. "There's a fog coming in," I said. "Is there? I hadn't noticed," she said. She wiped away a place on the window over the sink with a dish towel and looked out. For a minute she didn't say anything, and then she said, again mysteriously, or it seems to me now, "There is. Yes, it's very foggy. It's a heavy fog, isn't it?" And that's all she said. Then she lowered her eyes and began to wash the dishes. I sat at the table a while longer before I said, "I think I'll go to my room now." She took her hands out of the water and rested them against the counter. I thought she might prefer a word or two of encouragement for the work that I was engaged in. But she didn't. Not a peep. It was as if she were waiting for me to leave the kitchen so that she could enjoy her privacy. I remember I was at work in my room at the time the letter was slipped under the door. I read enough to question the handwriting, and to wonder how it was that my wife had presumably been busy somewhere else in the house and writing the letter at the same time. Before reading the further into the letter, I got up and went over to the door, unlocked it, and checked the corridor. It was dark at this end of the house, but when I cautiously put my head out, I could see a light from the living room at the end of the hallway. The radio was playing quietly, as usual. Why did I hesitate? Except for the fog, it was a night very much like any other we'd spent together in the house. But there was something else afoot tonight. At that moment I found myself afraid. Afraid, if you can believe it, in my own house. To walk down the hall and satisfy myself that all was well. Or if something was wrong, if my wife was experiencing, how should I put it, difficulties of any sort, hadn't I best confront the situation before letting it go any further? Before losing any more time on this stupid business of reading her words in someone else's handwriting? But I didn't investigate. Perhaps I wanted to avoid a frontal attack. In any case, I drew back, shut and locked the door before returning to the letter. I was now angry as I saw the evening sliding away in this foolish and incomprehensible business. I was beginning to feel uneasy. No other word will do. I could feel my gorge rising as I picked up the letter purporting to be from my wife, and once more began to read. The time has come and gone for us. Us, you and me, to put all our cards on the table. Thee and me, Lancelot and Guinevere, Abelard and Heloise, Troilus and Cressida, Pyramus and Thisbe, James Joyce and Nora Barnacle. You know what I'm saying, honey? We've been together a long time. Thick and thin, illness and health, stomach distress, eye, ear, nose, throat trouble, high times and low. Now, well, I don't know what else I can say now except the truth. I can't go it another step. At this point I threw the letter down and went to the door again, deciding to settle this once and for all. I wanted an accounting, and I wanted it now. I was, I think, in a rage, but at this point, just as I opened the door, I heard a low murmuring from the living room. It was as if someone were trying to say something over the phone, and this somebody were taking pains not to be overheard. Then I heard the receiver being replaced. Just this. And then everything was as before. The radio playing softly, the house otherwise quiet. But I'd heard a voice. In place of anger, I began to feel panic. I grew afraid as I looked down the corridor. Things were the same as before. The light was on in the living room. The radio played softly. I took a few steps and listened. I hoped I might hear the comforting, rhythmic clicking of knitting needles, or the sound of a page being turned, but there was nothing of the sort. I took a few steps towards the living room, and then, what should I say, I lost my nerve, or maybe my curiosity. It was at that moment that I heard the muted sound of a doorknob being turned, and afterwards the unmistakable sound of a door opening and closing quietly. My impulse was to walk rapidly down the corridor and into the living room, and get to the bottom of this thing for once and for all, but I didn't want to act impulsively, and possibly discredit myself. I'm not impulsive, so I waited, but there was activity of some sort in the house. Something was afoot, I was sure of it, and of course it was my duty, for my own peace of mind, not to mention the possible safety and well-being of my wife, to act. But I didn't. I couldn't. The moment was there, but I hesitated. Suddenly it was too late for any decisive action. The moment had come and gone, and could not be called back. Just so did Darius hesitate, and then fail to act at the Battle of Granicus. And the day was lost, Alexander the Great rolling him up on every side, and giving him a real walloping. I went back to my room and closed the door, but my heart was racing. I sat in my chair and, trembling, picked up the pages of the letter once more. But now here's the curious thing. Instead of beginning to read the letter through, from start to finish, or even starting at the point where I'd stopped earlier, I took the pages at random, held them under the table lamp, picking out a line here and a line there. This allowed me to juxtapose the charges made against me until the entire indictment, for that's what it was, took on quite another character. One more acceptable, since it had lost its chronology, and with it a little of its punch. So, well, in this manner, going from page to page, here a line, there a line, I read in snatches the following, which might under different circumstances serve as a kind of abstract. Withdrawing farther into, a small enough thing, but talcum powder sprayed all over the bathroom, including the walls and baseboards. A shell. not to mention the insane asylum, until finally, a balanced view. The grave, your work. Please give me a break. No one, not another word on the subject. The children. But the real issue, not to mention the loneliness. Jesus H. Christ, really, I mean. At this point, I distinctly heard the front door close. I dropped the pages of the letter onto the desk and hurried to the living room. It didn't take long to see that my wife wasn't in the house. The house is small, 2 bedrooms, one of which we referred to as my room, or on occasion as my study. But let the record show, every light in the house was burning. A heavy fog lay outside the windows, a fog so dense that I could scarcely see the driveway. The porch light was on, and a suitcase stood outside on the porch. It was my wife's suitcase, the one she'd bought and packed full of her things when we moved here. What on earth was going on? I opened the door. Suddenly, I don't know how to say this other than how it was, a horse stepped out of the fog, and then, an instant later, as I watched, dumbfounded, another horse. These horses were grazing on our front yard. I saw my wife alongside one of the horses, and I called her name. "Come on out here," she said. "Look at this. Doesn't this beat anything?" She was standing beside this big horse, patting its flank. She was dressed in her best clothes and had on heels and was wearing a hat. I hadn't seen her in a hat since her mother's funeral, 3 years before. Then she moved forward and put her face against the horse's mane. "Where did you come from, you big baby?" she said. "Where did you come from, sweetheart?" And then, as I watched, she began to cry into the horse's mane. There, I said, and started down the steps. I went over and patted the horse, and then touched my wife's shoulder. She drew back. The horse snorted, raised its head a moment, and then went to cropping the grass once more. "What is it?" I said to my wife. "For God's sake, what's happening here anyway?" She didn't answer. The horse moved a few steps, but continued pulling and eating the grass. The other horse was munching grass as well. My wife moved with the horse, hanging onto its mane. I put my hand against the horse's neck and felt a surge of power run up my arm to the shoulder. I shivered. My wife was still crying. I felt helpless, but I was scared too. "Can you tell me what's going on?" I said. "Why are you dressed like this? What's the suitcase doing on the front porch? Where did these horses come from, for God's sake? Can you tell me what's happening?" My wife began to croon to the horse. Croon. Then she stopped and said, "You didn't read my letter, did you? You might have skimmed it, but you didn't read it. Admit it." "I did read it," I said. I was lying, yes, but it was a white lie. A partial untruth. But he who was blameless, let him throw out the first stone. "Tell me what's going on anyway," I said. My wife turned her head from side to side. She pushed her face into the horse's dark, wet mane. I could hear the horse chomp, 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 and then it snorted as it took in air through its nostrils. She said, "There was this girl, you see. Are you listening? And this girl loved this boy so much. She loved him even more than herself. But the boy, well, he grew up. I don't know what happened to him. Something, anyway. He got cruel without meaning to be cruel, and I didn't catch the rest, because just then a car appeared out of the fog, in the drive, with its headlights on and flashing blue lights on the roof. It was followed a minute later by a pickup truck, pulling what looked like a horse trailer. Though with the fog it was hard to tell. It could have been anything. A big portable oven, say. The car pulled up right onto the lawn and stopped, and then the pickup drove alongside the car and stopped too. Both vehicles kept their headlights on and their engines running, which contributed to the eerie, bizarre aspect of things. A man wearing a cowboy hat, a rancher I supposed, stepped out from the pickup. He raised the collar on his sheepskin coat and whistled to the horses. Then a big man in a raincoat got out of the car. He was much bigger than the rancher, and he, too, was wearing a cowboy hat. But his raincoat was open, and I could see a pistol strapped to his waist. He had to be a deputy sheriff. Despite everything that was going on, and the anxiety that I felt, I found it worth noting that both men were wearing hats. I ran my hands through my hair, and I was sorry I wasn't wearing a hat of my own. I called the sheriff's department a while ago, my wife said, when I first saw the horses. She waited a minute, and then she said something else. Now you won't need to give me a ride into town after all. I mentioned that in my letter, the letter you read. I said I'd need to ride into town. I can get a ride, at least I think I can, with one of these gentlemen. And I'm not changing my mind about anything either. I'm saying this decision is irrevocable. Look at me, she said. I'd been watching them round up the horses. The deputy was holding his flashlight while the rancher walked the horse up a little ramp into the trailer. I turned to look at this woman that I didn't know any longer. I'm leaving you, she said. That's what's happening. I'm heading in for town tonight. I'm striking out on my own. It's all in the letter you read. Whereas, as I'd said earlier, my wife never underlined the words in her letters. She was now speaking, having dried her tears, as if virtually every other word out of her mouth ought to be emphasized. What's gotten into you? I heard myself say. It was almost as if I couldn't help adding pressure to some of my own words. Why are you doing this? She shook her head. The rancher was loading the second horse into the trailer now, whistling sharply, clapping his hands and kept shouting the occasional, Whoa, whoa, damn you! Back up now, back up. The deputy came over to us with a clipboard under his arm. He was holding a big flashlight. Who called? He said. I did, my wife said. The deputy looked over her for a minute. He flashed the light onto her high heels and then up at her hat. You're all dressed up, he said. I'm leaving my husband, she said. The deputy nodded, as if he understood. But he didn't. He couldn't. He's not going to give you any trouble, is he? The deputy said, shining his light into my face and moving the light up and down rapidly. You're not, are you? No, I said. No trouble, but I resent... Good, the deputy said. Enough said. The rancher closed and latched the door to his trailer. Then he walked towards us through the wet grass, which I noticed reached the tops of his boots. I want to thank you folks for calling, he said. Much obliged. It's one heavy fog. If they'd have wandered into the main road, they could have raised all kinds of hell out there. A lady placed the call, the deputy said. Frank, she needs a ride into town. She's leaving home. I don't know who the injured party is here, but she's the one leaving. He turned then to my wife. You sure about this, he said to her. She nodded. I'm sure. Okay, the deputy said. That's settled. Anyway, Frank, you listening? I can't drive her into town. I got another stop to make. So can you help her out and take her into town? She probably wants to go to the bus station or else the hotel. It's where they usually go. Is that where you want to go? The deputy asked my wife. Frank needs to know. He can drop me off at the bus station, my wife said. That's my suitcase on the porch. What about it, Frank? The deputy said. I guess I can, sure, Frank said, taking off his hat and putting it back on again. I'd be glad to, I guess. I don't want to interfere or anything. Not in the least, my wife said. I don't want to be any trouble, but I'm distressed just now. Yes, I'm distressed. But it'll be all right once I'm away from here, away from this awful place. I'll just check and make doubly sure I haven't left anything behind. Anything important, she added. She hesitated, and then she said, This isn't as sudden as it looks. It's been coming for a long, long time. We've been married for a good many years. Good times and bad, up times and down. We've had 'em all. But it's time I was on my own. Yeah, it's time. You know what I'm saying, gentlemen? Frank took off his hat again and turned it around in his hands, as if examining the brim, and then he put it back on his head. The deputy said, These things happen. Lord knows none of us is perfect. We weren't made perfect. The only angels is to be found in heaven. My wife moved towards the house, picking her way through the wet, shaggy grass in high heels. She opened the front door and went inside. I could see her moving behind the lighted windows, and something came to me then. I might never see her again. That's what crossed my mind, and it staggered me. The rancher, the deputy, and I stood around waiting, not saying anything. The damp fog drifted between us and the lights from their vehicles. I could hear the horses shifting in the trailer. We were all uncomfortable, I think. But I'm speaking only for myself, of course. I don't know how they felt. Maybe they saw things like this happen every night. Saw people's lives falling apart. The deputy did, maybe. But Frank, the rancher, he kept his eyes lowered. He put his hands in his front pockets and then took them out again. He kicked at something in the grass. I folded my arms and went on standing there, not knowing what was going to happen next. The deputy kept turning off his flashlight and then turning it on again. Every so often he'd reach out and swat the fog with it. One of the horses whinnied from the trailer, and then the other horse whinnied too. "Fella can't see anything in this fog," Frank said. I knew he was saying it just to make conversation. "It's as bad as I've ever seen it," the deputy said. Then he looked over at me. He didn't shine the light in my eyes this time, but he said something. He said, "Why'd she leaving you? You hit her or something? Give her a smack, did you?" "I've never hit her," I said. "Not in all the time we've been married. There was reason enough a few times, but I didn't. She hit me once," I said. "Now, don't get started," the deputy said. "I don't want to hear no crap tonight. Don't say anything, and there won't be anything. No rough stuff, don't even think it. There isn't going to be any trouble here tonight, is there?" The deputy and Frank were watching me. I could tell Frank was embarrassed. He took out his makings and began to roll a cigarette. "No," I said. "No trouble." My wife came out onto the porch and picked up a suitcase. I had the feeling not only had she taken the last look around, but she'd also used the opportunity to freshen herself up, put on new lipstick. The deputy held his flashlight for her as she came towards the steps. "Right this way, ma'am," he said. "Watch your step now. It's slippery." "I'm ready to go," she said. "Right," Frank said. "We'll just make sure we got all of this straight now." He took off his hat once more and held it. "I'll carry you into town, and I'll drop you off at the bus station. But you understand, I don't want to be in the middle of something, you know what I mean?" He looked at my wife, and then he looked at me. "That's right," the deputy said. "You said a mouthful. Statistics show that your domestic dispute is, time and time again, potentially the most dangerous situation a person, especially a law enforcement officer, can get himself involved in. But I think this situation is going to be the shining exception. Right, folks?" My wife looked at me and said, "I don't think I'll kiss you." "No, I won't kiss you goodbye. I'll just say so long. Take care of yourself." "That's right," the deputy said. "Kissing. Who knows what that'll lead to, right?" He laughed. I had a feeling that they were waiting for me to say something, but for the first time in my life, I felt a real loss for words. And then I took heart and said to my wife, "The last time you wore that hat, you wore a veil with it, and I held your arm. You were in mourning for your mother. You wore a dark dress, not the dress you're wearing tonight. But those are the same high heels, I remember." "Don't leave me like this," I said. "I don't know what I'll do." "I have to," she said. "It's all in the letter. Everything's spelled out in the letter. The rest is in the area of, I don't know, mystery or speculation, I guess. In any case, there's nothing in the letter you don't already know." Then she turned to Frank and said, "Let's go, Frank. I can call you Frank, can't I?" "Call him anything you want," the deputy said, "as long as you call him in time for supper." He laughed again, a big hearty laugh. "Right," Frank said. "Sure, you can." "Well, okay, let's go then." He took the suitcase from my wife and went over to his pickup, put the suitcase into the cab. Then he stood by the passenger door side, holding it open. "I'll write after I'm settled," my wife said. "I think I will anyway. But first things first. We'll have to see." "Now you're talking," the deputy said. "Keep all lines of communication open. Good luck, Paddy," the deputy said to me. And then he went over to his own car and got in. The pickup made a wide, slow turn with the trailer across the lawn. One of the horses whinnied. The last image I have of my wife was when a match flared in the cab of the pickup, and I saw her lean over with a cigarette to accept the light the rancher was offering. Her hands were cupped around the hand that held the match. The deputy waited until the pickup and trailer had gone past him, and then he swung his car around, slipping in the wet grass until he found Purchase in the driveway, throwing gravel from under his tires. As he headed for the road, he tooted his horn. Tooted. Historians should use more words like tooted, or beeped, or blasted, especially at serious moments, such as after a massacre, or when an awful occurrence has cast its pall on the future of an entire nation. That's when a word like tooted is necessary. It's gold in a brass age. I'd like to say that it was at this moment, as I stood in the fog watching her drive off, that I remembered a black and white photograph of my wife holding her wedding bouquet. She was 18 years old, a mere girl. Her mother had shouted at me only a month before the wedding. Just a few minutes before the photo, she'd gotten married. She's smiling. She just finished or is about to begin laughing. In either case, her mouth is open and amazed, happiness as she looks into the camera. She's 3 months pregnant, though the camera doesn't show that, of course. But what if she is pregnant? So what? Wasn't everyone pregnant in those days? She's happy in any case. I was happy too. I know I was. We were both happy. I'm not in that particular picture, but I was close, only a few steps away, as I remember, shaking hands with someone offering me good wishes. My wife knew Latin and German, chemistry and physics and history, Shakespeare and all the other good things that they teach you in your private school. She knew how to properly hold a teacup. She knew how to cook and to make love. She was a prize. But I found this photograph, along with several others, a few days after the horse business, when I was going through my wife's belongings, trying to see what I could throw out and what I should keep. I was packing to move, and I looked at the photograph for a minute, and then I threw it away. I was ruthless. I told myself I didn't care. Why should I care? If I know anything, and I do, if I know the slightest thing about human nature, I know she won't be able to live without me. She'll come back to me, and soon. Better be soon. No, I don't know anything about anything. I never did. She's gone for good. She is, I can feel it. Gone and never coming back. Period. Not ever. I won't see her again unless we run into each other in the street somewhere. But there's still the question of the handwriting. There's a bewilderment. But the handwriting business isn't the important thing, of course. How could it be after the consequences of the letter? Not the letter itself, but the things I can't forget were in the letter. No. The letter's not paramount at all. There's far more to do with this than somebody's handwriting. Far more has to do with subtle things. It could be said, for instance, that to take a wife is to take history. And if that's so, then I understand that I'm outside history now. Like horses in fog. Or you could say that my history has left me. Or that I'm having to go on without history. Or that history will now have to do without me. Unless my wife writes more letters, or tells a friend who keeps a diary. Then, years later, someone can look back on this time, interpreted according to the record. Its scraps and tirades, its silences and innuendos. And that's when it dawns on me that the autobiography is the poor man's history, and that I'm saying goodbye to history. Goodbye, my darling.